All right, well, welcome everyone. It's good to see you all. No one in the front row, just like your kids. That's cool, I got it. I hope I've met all of you, but I'm sorry if I haven't. My name is Brian Bloomfield, I'm the director here. Yes. And welcome to our first Parent Education Night of the year. Now, Parent Education Nights are a joint venture between the school and the NOVA PTO, and our goal this year is to put on Parent Education Nights around topics that are of direct interest to you, things you want to hear about, things you want to talk about, things you want to share. So we're talking over a number of different formats for how these will work. Tonight is kind of more of a traditional presentation Q&A, but we have a lot of options for how these evenings could go. We've talked about a number of topics, from things related to NOVA itself, like tonight we'll do classical education, next month we'll do an education night on Singapore math model for families. For the future, we've talked about going off curriculum and talking about things like prescription drug issues with adolescents and social emotional forces that confront adolescents and parents, and how to tie those virtues to family life, which would be more of a round table where parents can share ideas as well as give and take. So please contact me or contact the PTO if you have any ideas for topics you think might be interesting for Parent Education Night. We want these to be interesting for you. These started 5 years ago, and the simple idea was that NOVA parents have often said to many of us that this is the kind of education that they wish that they had had themselves. So we thought we would begin to introduce some of the curricular topics to you to see how you like them, and they kind of have grown from there. So I'm very grateful to the PTO for their partnership, for both the treats and the coffee, as well as the opportunity to participate in Great Gathering, which is our next big event here on Saturday, November 3rd. And we will just get started. If you have questions or thoughts, just raise your hands. For those of you who haven't worked with me before, I talk a lot, so you want to interrupt me. If you want to get a word in edgewise, you're going to want to interrupt me. The PowerPoint presentation, as well as the handout, which there should be enough handouts for everyone on the chairs on here. I'll pass a few around. There's just one handout. These are also available on our website under Family Life, PTO, Parent Education, so you can always see these later. All right, can everyone hear me okay? Any questions before we get going? Okay, I notice if I turn my head this way, the microphone doesn't work, so I'll try to keep my head this way. So I wanted to begin tonight with a simple quote from Terry Eagleton. And Terry Eagleton is a very mediocre literary critic in the 20th century. He's not particularly important. But what he does here, which is really important, is he quotes I.A. Richards, who's a very important formalist literary critic from the early 20th century. And I.A. Richards says that society is in crisis because historical change and scientific discovery in particular has outstripped and devalued traditional mythologies by which men and women have lived. So one of the products Richards is arguing of the scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment, is that the cultural mythologies, the stories of how we get meaning, have been torn away from us. They become superstition, and they become devalued compared to scientific inquiry and knowledge. Classical education, which is itself born in the mid-20th century, is partly a reaction to that idea. So progressivist education, which is about what you experience as a human being, as an individual, your natural curiosities, the world around you, child-centered educational models where the child's natural proclivities dictate what you study. These became the norm in mid-20th century thinking. They were championed by people such as John Dewey and others, and they built off of earlier philosophers. And that's what the modern educational movement is largely about. Child-centered education or child-focused learning, sometimes called student-centered education, experience rather than knowledge or data, and with the students and the drivers. And what that does is when we say something is important, we no longer ask, is it important because the adults say it's important, or is it important because children say it's important? So progressivist education as a child-centered model puts the child's natural intuition, curiosity at the center. Classical education and other forms of education are a reaction against that to reclaim an older model where we can start talking about traditional values or mythologies. And we'll get into that. So tonight I want to do a brief introduction and go over some basic vocabulary with you, and this can be hopefully an interactive part. We will have a sample lesson for you on Shakespeare's 29th sonnet, which hopefully you'll enjoy. And then obviously Q&A at the end, and like I said, please feel free to interrupt with questions all throughout. So some basic introductory information about classical education. Number one is it's medieval, it's not ancient. People sometimes think that because we say classical and they think Greco-Roman, that this in some way resembles the educational model of Plato or Aristotle. That's actually not true. Classical education is a medieval system. It grew up around the university structure in the High Middle Ages. It is primary source-based, which means we're interested in kids getting their hands on the materials themselves, not on someone else's interpretation or interpolation of materials, as soon as possible. It's systematic, which means we don't just randomly go in certain ways. Everything we do ties in programmatically, chronologically to something else that we do. There's a reason for it. It spirals. This is true at Nova. So what you see here is that in first grade through fifth grade, we go through, first grade through fourth grade, we go through each of the historical epochs in history. So we start with ancient history, and then we move on to medieval and Renaissance history, and then into modern, and then into contemporary history. And then in fifth grade, we start that cycle again. And then in ninth grade, we start that cycle again. So that's what we mean by spiraling. If you're here for the entire K-12 experience, you'll study ancient history, ancient literature, ancient music 3 times, each time kind of elevating the discourse. And at Nova in particular, it's history-centered. Not all classical education models are history-centered, but at Nova, because we grew out of the well-trained mind and model, the homeschool model, history is the backbone of what we do here. So it ties into the history, it ties into the literature, it ties into the art, it ties into the music. So the period of history, which is the theme of the year, is covered in multiple subjects. Some of the core principles. This is a very language-intensive model of education. Language is important to classical education because Plato believed that ideas exist as these, what we call forms, as these infinite concepts. But when you talk about ideas, you're going from the abstract to the real. I would say that. So you can imagine a tree, like an oak tree. And you can imagine a spruce tree, and you can imagine a pine tree. You can imagine a Christmas tree. And they're all trees, so you can recognize the word tree in all of them. But in Plato's world, they all descend from an originating concept of tree, what we would call the form of a tree. And every tree you've ever seen is simply an imperfect manifestation of that ideal. Well, his idea extends to semiotics, so he expresses that language itself is an imperfect manifestation of everything. So if you say the word chair, if you say the word truth, if you say the word meaning, they're all calling upon some idea. And we use discourse, what he called dialectic, in order to kind of arrange between us what meanings actually are. I'm going to stop and see if that made any sense, or if I can try to explain that more clearly. For Plato, the search for truth and the search for goodness, which are the same thing, come through the art of dialectic, the interchange of words. Through discussion, argument, disagreement, lessons, that we come to a basic understanding of what the good is. That's why classical education is language-centered, because we believe the act of articulating and destroying and recreating through language brings you closer to understanding. I'll just leave that. We can talk about that later if you want. It's integrated and highlights with character education. So if we've learned anything from the 20th century, it's that knowledge without virtue is a very dangerous thing. It's the lesson. You don't learn anything else from the history of the Holocaust and World War II. It's that incredible intelligence without a moral compass is more dangerous than ignorance. So never before in history, and there are lots of examples of horrific, intelligent things of history, but we don't have to go back that far. Never before we had a clear mandate that virtue and character education is integral to what we do here. It is not enough simply to be smart. You have to be good as well. And that's a big part of what classical education is. And we will talk about that. Any questions about these words or ideas? Okay, classical education, I should say that part of the reason I do this is because there are different models of classical education. There's largely 3 families of classical education. There's the homeschool model, there's the parochial or the Christian school model, and then there's the rest of us. And we all share some core ideas, but in groups we have some fundamental differences. So Nova grew out of this homeschool model based off of The Well-Trained Mind, which is a book about classical homeschool, but it has adapted and grown into its own as a public school model. So that's the reason we do this, because if you say I came from a classical school, or I've been to a classical school, or my kid has seen a classical school, it may not exactly be the same as what we do here. But one thing that we all share is the concept of the trivium. The trivium is actually a very old idea. It grew out of the 2nd century. It's a Roman concept off of Marcellus. And the trivium is part of the 7 liberal arts, the daughters of philology and Mercury. The 7 liberal arts are broken into 2 sections, the trivium and the quadrivium. Trivium comes first, and it's grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Sometimes logic is called dialectic. And then the quadrivium are the subjects that you study after the trivium. So from early time, and this grew out of ancient times, but really took form in the Middle Ages, we have this concept of the trivium, 3 roads, 3 ways. And I'm going to pull from Dorothy Sayers' essay here, The Lost Tools of Learning, which is kind of the birth of the modern classical education movement in 1947. She calls the grammar stage the whole parrot, the logic, the pert, the rhetoric, the poetic stage. So we're going to talk about that in about 30 seconds. So the way that she conceived of the 7 liberal arts, based off of the medieval system of university education, is you learn grammar, logic, and rhetoric first, and once you've mastered those, then you enter into the quadrivium, which is astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music. And the concept is that once you've mastered all of these, you've mastered the universe. This is everything there is to know in the universe. Arithmetic and music and geometry about form and balance and physics. So this is the basic idea that we all share in common. Obviously, in 2012, we learned more than astronomy and geometry, but the idea of the trivium still carries us forward. So, the first thing to recognize about the trivium is they don't refer to subjects, they refer to modes of thinking. Grammar is the basic foundation, the fundamental pieces of anything at all. Sayers calls it the whole parrot stage in kids' learning because they repeat what they're told. They just regurgitate information. So your grammar is your building block of any concept. So, I always say I'm not going to use this. I'm going to go with an omelet. I usually talk about carburetors, but I don't know anything about cars. So I'll talk about omelets because I know a lot about food. So, the grammar of your omelet would be what? Your eggs, so your ingredients. So you can have eggs, you can have milk, you can have peppers, you can have cheese. Good stuff. What else would be in the grammar besides your ingredients? Sorry? Your heat. How you cook. So you would actually have to have some sort of equipment. So a stove or cooktop or something with heat. And you obviously don't put your eggs on the heat, so you need some sort of a pan. So these are just the basic elemental pieces and parts of an omelet. They have nothing to do with the omelet, but they're all the different pieces that if you were to lay them all out, you need all of them in front of you in order to conceive of the concept of omelet. Does that make sense? Logic, or dialectic, is a middle form. What it does is it takes those little pieces and parts and it looks at the connection between them. Okay? So you have your eggs and you have your pan. So now you don't just say, I know what a pan is, I know what eggs are. You think about the eggs going in the pan, or the pan going on the eggs. That doesn't work. You think about how they fit together logically. You know you need heat to the eggs to cook them, but you need some sort of conductivity. You need some sort of material apparatus to hold the eggs because they don't just want to float on top of the heat. So you think, how would I do that? So I need something that'll hold the eggs. I would use a Tupperware container. Oh, that's not going to work with the heat, so I go back. I need something which will hold the eggs, which will transfer the heat. So I do something which is metal. And you need this non-stick stick. I could talk about eggs for a long time. I'm a big fan. But you get not just the grammar, not just the pieces, but the connection between them. And that's what logic is. We'll keep going to examples, obviously. Sayers calls this the pert stage because children who move into the logic stage around middle school years are pertinacious, they're obnoxious. And when children are young and they're in the grammar stage and someone says, this is an egg, the child says, that is an egg. This is a pan, that is a pan. And you can make a song, this is an egg, that is a pan. They go, this is an egg, that is a pan. And they'll be really happy about it. But when you get to 7th grade, you go, this is an egg. Someone will say, what kind of egg? Am I supposed to believe you that that's an egg? It's not an egg. And you go, oh, what am I going to do with you? So what it's saying is that Hey, look at that. At this point in the child's life, they're not just going to believe what you said because you said it. They're going to ask for more. They're going to need coordinations. They're going to be a little more difficult. But because we are able to use dialectic, it works out well. You'll see that. Okay. Rhetoric, which is the final stage, is the creation. This is where we actually make something, create something new. In Greek, the word is poesis, which means to do or to make, which is why Sayers calls it the poetic stage. So this is the time where you take the pieces and the parts, and you know how they all work together, and you put that all together, and you generate something. So this is where we make our omelets. Up until now, we've been talking about ingredients, apparatus, cooking materials, directions. We've been talking about recipes, we've been talking about how to cook, we've talked about different kinds of spatulas, my wife calls flippers, and how they work, whether you want to use non-stick or stick, and why that is, and the connections between what will happen to the eggs and surface tension, blah, blah, blah. But we haven't actually cooked anything. In the rhetoric stage, we get to make the egg, to make the omelet. And if we don't do it well, if we misunderstand how heat will affect the egg, and you take a non-stick pan and put it up to the highest level, and you let it warm up for 5 minutes, and then you crack your egg and dump it directly into the pan, you are not going to get an omelet. You're going to get a bubbly, sinister, crackling thing. So you misunderstood how the pieces and parts work together. So only do we get perfect poesis when we understand both the grammar and the logic and build upon one another. So since we haven't done an example yet, it's just, and I'm speaking generally, can I make any clarifications about how these 3 stages work and build upon each other? Yes?
I'm just curious about, well, the impression that I had when we talked about parents who are talking about maybe it's too technical.
Right. So the question is, when I'm talking about grammar, and I'm talking about the different ingredients, are we in fact talking about the relationship between them? And technically, no. In the grammar stage, we're not. We're just talking about the ingredients. But it doesn't actually work like that with the children. Because although we teach them facts and information in the school of grammar, we don't teach them that without any context or understanding of what they mean. Now the meaning behind the facts, like Ulysses S. Grant was the general of the U.S. Army during the Civil War, and Robert Lee was the general of the Confederate Army during the Civil War, the relationship between them is not the goal of the school of grammar. We really want them to memorize those names and those positions and those dates. But kids, because they're not automatons, do need some context and connection in order to bring those together. So we do talk about the relationship between them, just so they can remember the facts. We will revisit them in school logic, and the connection between them becomes the point of it. Does that make sense? But for adults in particular, it's very difficult to go through a grammar stage without trying to move forward. And although we do grammar K-5, logic 6-8, and rhetoric 9-12 at NOVA, and in a lot of classical schools that same model exists, these are not just ages. So I want you to think about something that you know nothing about. I don't know what something, I think there's a lot of nothing about. I know how to build a building now, but if we weren't for that, I'd say something like nuclear physics. I mean, not a clue. There's a button somewhere someone can push and we all go boom. That's what I know about nuclear physics. But if I were to study nuclear physics, I would start, at this age, at 39 years old, I would start with the grammar of nuclear physics, the vocabulary, the basic concepts, the basic archetypes that leads into physics, nuclear energy, the atom, the structure of the atom, and then I would eventually move into logic and rhetoric. So at any stage of your life, at any topic that you learn, there is a grammar to it, a logic to it, and a rhetoric to it. Whether you think of them as metaphors or stages, they're already there. In classical education, you just break them up almost artificially this way to focus on certain elements. Okay? Some common terms that you may have heard in and around classical education at NOVA, not at NOVA. Didactic. Didactic is from ancient Greek, and in this case it refers to the act of standing in front of the room and talking, lecturing almost, like I'm doing right now. Sometimes in education it's called sage on stage. It is generally frowned upon in modern education because people tend to think that when you're in an audience and you're listening to someone, you're being passive, and they prefer learners to be active. At NOVA, we don't believe that's true. We believe that you can be very actively engaged as an audience member if the lecture is interesting and the lecturer is engaging you intellectually. But that's what didactic means. It's kind of standing and delivering. Coaching is an interaction between unequal partners, and that's important. When you coach someone, think about just being on any athletic team. You have a coach and you have a player. They're not peers. There's a disequity, and they're supposed to be. When the coach tells you to run, you run. When the coach tells you to squat, you squat. You don't say, I don't really think that squats are the appropriate thing to do at this stage in the practice, because then you're running in the practice. So there is an interaction, more interactive than didactic teaching, but there's a power dynamic which is maintained. In Socratic dialogue, in its purest sense, what we call seminar here, you are still interacting, but it's peers, so everyone's voice is equal at the table. So what you basically have here is two different people, kind of a teacher and a student, and the power dynamic between them shifts from didactic, where all the power is with me, and none of it's with you unless I give it to you, to a coaching model where the power is with me, but I require your participation to do it because I'm coaching you. So if I tell you to run and you don't run, nothing's going to happen. Versus Socratic or pure dialogue where we are actually equals, in my opinion, your opinion are the same value. My Greek words, that's the kind of stuff that interests me, nobody else. Can I explain these or show the difference between these any more clearly at this point? Okay, so the question is, do they align more so with different stages? And in Mortimer Adler's work, they do align exactly with different stages. And no, but we understand that that's not exactly true. It would be silly for us to say, what I was saying earlier, that when your child's in the grammar stage, there's only grammar, there's no logic. Just like it would be silly to say that in the rhetoric stage, there's no instruction of grammar. I can tell you that watching my 10th graders take non-organic chemistry, it's very much a high-level grammar class. I mean, ions and protons and stoichiometry and balancing equations, I mean, it's an advanced grammar class. The same way is here. Didactic instruction kind of flows naturally with the school of grammar, where I say and you just repeat. The school of logic flows naturally with coaching, where there is a dialectic, but I'm in charge of it. And the school of rhetoric, where we do seminars, flows more naturally with the Socratic, where we're speaking to each other, but they are highly interactive, they are not static. So I want to stop and talk about if there are any other words or concepts, vocabulary, ideas that you've heard or read about around classical education, or you've heard around hallways, that we can kind of bring to the fore and share with one another. Calm down. I will call it all of you in turn. All right, let's, okay. When I say, we're going to go a different approach. Okay. When I say that progressivist education, which is the foundation of the modern American educational movement, focuses on the needs of the child, it's child-centered or student-centered learning. You take your kids to Highland High School, or you take your kids to Humboldt, you're going to get a child-centered education. Okay? Now I'll tell you, no, you are not going to get one. Your child's needs are not my primary concern. I'll get to the talk. Okay, so in this school, children learn what the adults tell them to learn, rather than what interests them. How do you feel about that? Really? Yes. What I think of poking is.
The flip side of that sitting on the stage, talking with the guy on the side.
Right.
How does that play out here? Is there room for the guy on the side?
The question is, the flip side, the corollary in this case is sage on the stage is the guide on the side. So what I want to do is get into how dialectic works in the school of logic, so you can see that in the hands of a well-trained and competent classical teacher, the movement between these three is really what makes classical education work. It's understanding when I want to focus on vocabulary, we focus on vocabulary. When I want to talk about what it means, we'll coach. Now I could simply say, someone could ask me a question like, you're sage on the stage, let's guide on the side, and I just answer your question, and then the whole unit becomes didactic. But what I want to do is try to coach you through how these things work, because I think it's more effective. All right, so we'll put you guys off the hook for the time being, and let's talk about our lesson. So for our lesson today, the first time we did this, we actually picked something from the school curriculum. And so we picked something from the grammar stage and logic and rhetoric stage, but they were a little bit too hard for the parents, just because you don't have the context for it. So what we've done ever since then is I've decided to pick something which I think is a bit of a reach for most people. We're going to do one Elizabethan poem. We're going to do a sonnet by William Shakespeare. And I'm picking this because, number one, it's language oriented. We could do this with science or math, but I would not be adept at guiding you through it. My background is in Renaissance English poetry, so we pick something I'm good at. It makes me feel powerful. But it is very language intensive, so I can walk you through it and help me illustrate the classical model. It's also something which is, we're going to talk about the grammar and the logic and rhetoric of the whole poem. So does everyone have copies of Shakespeare? Are there extra copies that people need? I have some extra handouts. There you are. Okay, this is Shakespeare's 29th sonnet. Shakespeare wrote 164 sonnet sequence. This is number 29. And they are untitled, so they simply go by their numbers, or sometimes the first line is used as the title. So we're going to begin with the grammar. We're going to do the grammar of the sonnet. To do the grammar, we're going to focus on vocabulary, technical vocabulary, technical skills, and maybe some vocal exercises, depending on how game you guys are with this. I've not found a lot of parents interested in it, so we'll see how you guys do. All right. So, the first thing we do with poetry, because it is an oral art, is we read it aloud. And we like to hear the language flowing over us. So what I'm looking for is a brave soul who wishes to elocute for us Shakespeare's 29th sonnet. And I will just pick, oh good, I was going over the top. Thank you very much. You want a microphone?
I'll try one, sure.
All right, this is exciting. It is not often I get a volunteer. I usually have to make volunteers. All right, so all you have to do is listen and enjoy. There you go.
Say
When?
when, in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented like least, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Sonnet 29 by William Shakespeare.
Thank you very much. Brave soul. There's a special reward in heaven for you. Okay. This is an important update for you all. Nova's girls varsity volleyball team is currently playing a conference championship game. It's our first conference championship game ever. They're playing against the Minnesota Academy for the Deaf, who whooped us last time. They just whooped us. It was like we weren't even in it. Okay, so we lost the first game 25-17. We won the second game 25-21, and we are currently tied 10-10 in the third game. Very intense. Better than getting whooped. Okay. So we're going to start with basic. I'll keep you up to date on what's happening here. I should be there, but I'm here to find folks. All right. So let's start with vocabulary. You can't understand something that's written if you don't know the words. So there are words in here that I have glossed for you based on my appreciation for things that you may not know if you don't read 16th and 17th century literature on. So I put them to the side. So let's just look at a couple of words. There may be more than what I put here. I'm sorry if I missed something. Let's just clarify them. Let's just go 2 lines at a time. When you disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I alone will weep. My outcast state. Now, I'm not asking what it means. I'm just saying, are there words there that we don't understand? So I picked be weep, not a real common word, in 2012, and it means weep. It means I cry. It just means I cry. Keep coming. He's not that hard. Troubled at heaven with my bootless cries, and looked upon myself and cursed my fate. We don't really use the word bootless anymore. Bootless means without foundation, without strength. Literally, my foot is not on the ground. It just means weak. Okay? All the other words are probably pretty common. Wishing me like to one more rich and hope, featured like him with friends possess. Featured here is a little bit different. It refers not to feature film, but it refers to one's features, physical features. We'll talk about that later. And possessed just means to possess something. Just drop the E out of there so it fit the rhythm. Okay. Desiring this man's art and that man's scope. That's a little harder. Someone's art is their what? It's their talent. It's what they do. It's their profession. It's their hobby. It's literally what they do for a living. And a person's scope is his. I'm sorry? Potential? It's not his potential. It's his influence. It's how big, literally scope, what you can see. It's how big or small he is. So the President of the United States has a larger scope than a sanitation worker who works in the city, just because he or she affects more people. Larger scope. Oh, you're off. You want to get home from the debates. Okay, now this is what I don't forgot. Wow, debates, volleyball, classical education, what a night. With what I most enjoy, contented least, these thoughts, myself almost despising. Happily, I think I mean, okay, happily. This is a weird word that doesn't exist anymore. Happily means suddenly. It does not mean happily. Like happenstance, I happened upon something. Happily, it's just a root that we don't use in that way anymore. And then my state, my status, like to the lark, the break of day rising. What's a lark? It's a bird. Good. When does that particular bird sing? In the morning. Romeo and Juliet. Does the nightingale? No, it is the lark. No, does the nightingale? Stay with me. From solid earth sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love such wealth brings that I scorn to change my state with kings. So, not even knowing what the poem means yet, are there any words in there, vocabulary, that I can explain? Okay, the next thing we will do with a sonnet is talk about the grammar of a sonnet. This is an English sonnet, sometimes called an Elizabethan sonnet, and you have to have certain rules in place to be called an Elizabethan sonnet. Number one, all Elizabethan sonnets have 14 lines. They all do. Number two, they're written in iambic pentameter, which means there are 5 iambs. Now, an iamb is what we call a foot. It's a particular way in which you express poetry. It's an arrangement of syllables, and there are lots of different feet in poetry. An iamb is one very common in the English language. It's a 2-syllable artifact where there's an unaccented syllable followed by an accented one. So it goes da-da, da-da, da-da. 3 iambs in a row. So each foot has 2 syllables. So iambic pentameter is 5 2-syllable feet. Each line, 10 syllables. Make sense? Iambs are the natural rhythm to the English language. There are different feet available to write in. There's trochaic. There's all these different forms. Dactylic. The ancient Greeks wrote in dactylic hexameter because it was more natural to Greek, but we use iambs. So when you read rhythm, or what we call scanning in English sonnet, you read da-da, da-da, da-da. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beneath my outcast state. It's how you learn how to read poetry. It's how you learn how to read the language. The accents fall where the accents need to fall so that you keep moving along. If we interrupted it, then you would all of a sudden stumble. And I can show you other examples. But that's just a little bit by English sonnets. There are 14 lines. They're always in English sonnets. And they're written in iambic pentameter. Next, you don't know it, but this sonnet has a structure to it. which is the same for every English sonnet ever written. 14 lines broken into 4 sections. The first 4 lines of the poem are called a quatrain. So again, I'm giving you technical vocabulary, which is what we would do in the grammar stage of studying the poem. 4 lines of poetry is called a quatrain. Now, it's not just that there are 4 lines of poetry, but 4 lines that go together. That's what makes them a quatrain. So you'll see as you look at this poem, the first 4 lines, 1 sentence. See the period? So you take them as 1 sentence, 1 idea. Then you go to the next 4 lines, the next quatrain, it's another idea. Then you go to the third 4 lines, third quatrain, a third idea. The last 2 lines called a couplet, another idea. So 14 lines, 4 ideas. Quatrain, 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 couplet. Got it? Now this helps you. Understanding the grammar of a sonnet helps you because you know by the time you get to line 4, if you don't know what's going on, you get to line 5, something new is happening. So you can kind of mark confusion, confusion, let me try again. You know there's a break there. Okay? Now the other thing about English sonnets is we have something called a turn. It always happens between line 8 and line 9. So what happens is the first quatrain represents an idea. The second quatrain represents a different idea, but the 2 are linked. They're similar somehow. They have to do with each other. And then you get to the third quatrain. It's called a turn. And what you have is a 90-degree, or in this case a 180-degree orthogonal turn. The third quatrain expresses an idea which is opposite from the first 2 quatrains. And it usually begins with the word but or yet. To signal to you, I'm about to go in a totally different direction. So quatrain 1, quatrain 2, 2 different ideas that are linked along a theme. Quatrain 3, idea which is linked with itself, which is the opposite of the first 2. And then the couplet summarizes the whole poem. So if you don't get the first 12 lines, read the last 2 lines, and you got the poem. It's like a Cliff Notes. And that's every English sonnet ever written, ever. If you call yourself an English sonneteer, you call your poem an English sonnet, Elizabethan sonnet, it follows all those rules. You can't not follow those rules and be a sonnet. Answer any questions about that? Okay, this is called formal poetry, all right? Which is the best kind of poetry. Because it has meaning, the shape, the structure gives its meaning. To know that there's always a turn between the 8th and the 9th line means that there's a story to tell. And the story in Shakespeare sonnets is always the same. Go, 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 change, go, go, go. So either things are really bad and then they get really good, or things are really good and then they get really bad. Melodrama. He wasn't a subtle guy. So, those are just some of the formal elements. Now at this point, if we were going to do the actual scanning of the poem and you were second graders, I would actually bring out bongos. I'm not going to do that. But bongos help kids keep rhythm. Da 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 da. I can do that. But there's 140 syllables in this poem, and I can't keep their attention that long. But if someone's hitting a drum, forget about it. We can do it for an hour, and no one can get his place on it. So we would teach you how to scan. We would help you practice it. You would write each line, and then you would simply write over the lines, I all alone beweep my outcast state. You would write you underneath, over every unaccented syllable, and a little diagonal slash called accent grave over all the accented lines. It would teach you to go da 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 da, give you a visual cue for how to read the poem. All these things would come along simply with the grammar of the poem, the technical vocabulary, the vocabulary itself, the structure of the poem, the meaning of the form of the poem. Have we talked about what the poem means? We haven't even talked about it yet, right? We're all still in the grammar stage. So all this is an introduction to how you read this poem and every poem just like it. Now some of these lessons are portable. Some of these lessons about vocabulary, technical vocabulary, would carry over into unformed poetry. You know, Ginsberg poetry, William Carlos Williams. You still need to know what the words mean. You still need to know if there's some kind of structure at play. You also need to know if there's a lack of structure at play for a particular reason. So the lessons are still there, they're just applied differently. But the basic idea of the grammar of poetry would still hold anywhere. It just fits right here very clearly applied at the poem. Can I answer any questions about the grammar? Let me see if we covered everything. We got all the vocabulary. We talked about Elizabethan sonnet. We didn't talk about Italian sonnets. You didn't seem that interested in them, but they're cool too. Iambic pentameter. Oh, I didn't talk about rhyme scheme. There's a rhyme scheme to an English sonnet. It's the same every time. How did I not talk about rhyme scheme? I talked about meter, which is the iambic pentameter, not rhyme scheme. Eyes, cries, state, fate, hope, scope, zest, lease, spising, rising, state, gate, brings, gains. A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G. Okay? The first and the third line, the second and the fourth line. Fifth and the seventh line. Now, usually, if you're good, the first and the third line, they rhyme, and that rhyme is not repeated anywhere else in the sonnet. If you're not as good, you will repeat that same rhyme somewhere else in the sonnet. Shakespeare does that a few times. But in general, that's why you have A, B, C, D, C, D. It means that this is C, and that is C, so hope and scope, and you won't repeat that O anywhere else, otherwise it would still be C somewhere else. So a little bit of help, right? So all those things are true. Yes, sir?
Does that mean Shakespeare would have rhymed less, least?
Zest, lest.
Okay.
Yes. Shakespeare was not the greatest writer in English history.
Because Bob Dylan does that a lot too.
Yes. These are what we call, well, in 2012 we called them imperfect rhymes. If you would have learned this 20 years ago, or any time in the 300 years before that, it would be called a feminine rhyme. But now we call it a perfect rhyme. We don't want to be killed. I didn't make this up, folks. I'm just telling you. Yes, so Shakespeare was not the greatest writer of the English language, and certainly not the smartest writer of the English language by any stretch, but what he did, better than anyone else I've ever read, is he made language do what he wanted it to do. He was extremely gifted wordsmith, and just bent rules of language like I've never seen before. So for him, rhyming possessed with least is nothing. I mean, that's not even breaking a sweat for Shakespeare. He doesn't even care about that. You should see some of the weird things he does. Like possessed. People get into this stuff with the apostrophes. Featured like him with friends possessed. Why is there an apostrophe there? Why isn't there just an E? An extra syllable. He doesn't want an extra syllable. He needs 10 syllables. He wrote a line that had 11 syllables, and he knew he couldn't do that, so what did he do? He just got rid of a letter. That's all. That's all it is. 90% of the time when you see something like that in the 16th century, the spellings of words were not standardized until the publication of the dictionary in the early 19th century. So words were spelled differently all the time. And usually they were spelled smaller because of the advent of movable typesetting, where people would literally take little letters and slide them along rails and ink them and pass them down. It takes longer to put 7 letters than it does to put 4, so they would just make words smaller, cut out vowels because it was cheaper, less labor. Just like texting, just like being lazy, but not your kids. So all these weird things that people just have to get used to when they study 16th century literature, they were mostly not for artistic or creative enterprises. They were because Shakespeare needed this to have 10 syllables and it had 11. We just cut one out. That's usually what it is for something like that. Okay, we talked about quatrains and couplets. We talked about scanning lines, which we're not going to do. I'm not going to make you do it with the bongos. I'm not going to make you do the drum beat. Imagine I'm doing that because I know you want to get home to the debate. So we're going to grammar stage, the essential tool is memory. Students learn to take in large quantities of data and retrieve it back at the appropriate time. That second part is really important. People think we just teach kids to memorize things. It's not enough to memorize things. I say, who was the U.S. general that led the U.S. Civil War, the Union soldiers of the U.S. Civil War? And you said, 17. Well, 17 is the answer to something that you memorized in math, but it's not really what I'm looking for now. So it's not just memorizing, it's recalling it at the appropriate time. So context does come in a certain degree. We went through the whole grammar of the sonnet, didn't understand a word of it. Understanding is not the focus of the school of grammar. We use a lot of mnemonic devices here, chants, songs, rhymes, memories. Memory strengthens the mind. We're going to go faster, because I'm taking too long. I'll move faster through the logic stage. Structural connections, linguistic connections, we start really talking about virtue. In the grammar stage, we point out the virtues. In the logic stage, we start actually exploring them. All right, connections between the quatrains and the turn in the poem. Ready? I'm going to go quickly, so just because it's 7:20. They're like, yeah. whatever. Okay. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, when I'm feeling disgraced, both by fortune, fate, luck, and other people, I all alone beweep my outcasting. I cry about my status as an outsider. So when everyone hates me, I cry by myself. Okay? Now normally if we had more time, we would do this more slowly. I'm just going to hand give some. I trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. So when you don't understand Shakespeare, just drop the adjective straight away. I trouble heaven with my cries. Right? So I'm crying to heaven for something. But heaven is deaf because it's not listening to me. And my cries are bootless because they're not doing anything. So I'm troubling deaf heaven with my useless, bootless foundations cries. And look upon myself and curse my fate. So pretty sad, unhappy things. It's not a bummer, it's a downer. It's a downer sonnet. Okay? So that's first quatrain. The second quatrain will have a similar message to the first one, but be separate. Wishing me like to want more rich in hope. So I am wishing that I were like someone else who were richer in hope. Make sense? And this is what this quatrain is going to be about. Featured like him, meaning what? Not just be like that person, featured like him, be specific. Physically, I wish I looked like that person. So I'm imagining I'm like someone more rich in hope. I'm imagining I'm someone else. This person is more rich in hope. I wish I looked like him with friends possessed. I wish I had friends like he does. Desiring this man's art. I wish I could do what this man can do. Or that man's scope. I wish I had this other person's influence. With what I most enjoy, contented least. That's a hard line. So the things that I enjoy the most, I wish that what? I wish I liked them the least. I literally wish I were the opposite of what I am. I wish I were like this guy. I wish I were like that guy. I wish I were like everyone else except me. I want to look like that one. I want to have that man's ability. I want to have that one's influence. I wish I had that person's hope. I literally wish the things I love the most are the things that I hate the most. I wish I were the opposite of who I am. So pretty bummer. It's a bummer of a poem. Right? So those are the first 8 lines. Quatrain and quatrain. So the first line is about feeling alone. The second line is about comparing myself and wishing I were someone else. They're connected in idea. They're thematically connected, but they're separate from one another. Makes sense? Now we get to the turn. Okay? Turn. Everyone excited for the turn? Here we go. Yet, in these thoughts, myself almost despising. I love that almost. Because I'm thinking, that wasn't despising yourself, that was almost despising yourself. So, in these thoughts, myself almost despising, happily, suddenly, I think on thee. Who's he talking to? Who do you think he's talking to?
A woman.
A woman. He's talking to a woman. Sure. Happily, I think on thee. And then, now, you have to watch out for poetry, because when people read it, they think that the ends of lines are ends of sentences. That's not actually true. So, happily, I think on thee. And then my state, skip the simile, we'll come back to it. Then my state sings hymns at heaven's gate. So all of a sudden, my state, my status, is singing hymns at heaven's gate. So I've gone from troubling deaf heaven with my bootless cries to singing hymns at heaven's gate. Literally, I mean, the opposite, the 180-degree opposite from where I was in the beginning. Now go back and find the simile. Shakespeare is really famous for these long similes that confuse people. If you ever get lost in Shakespeare, drop the adjectives, look for the subject, look for the verb. So, my state sings, you have to find the verb. Here's the simile. My state, like to the lark at the break of day arising from solid earth. So like this bird sings in the morning, coming out of the sullen ground, singing to heaven. It's all just a simile, just a metaphor, extended metaphor. Find the subject and the verb. My state sings hymns at heaven's gate. So what happened? I was down, I was low, I was depressed, I felt useless, hopeless, helpless, hapless, ugly, stupid. I wanted to be like you, anyone but me. Literally the opposite of me. And then, happily, I think on me. And then my state sings hymns at heaven's gates. What do you think about you? sweetheart, and I'm singing hymns at Heaven's Gate like the lark. No, I'm just total transformation, just because I thought of you. Third quatrain, completely contained idea, 180-degree turn from the first two quatrains. Okay? Then I get the Cliff Notes, I get my summary, and a rhyming couplet. For thy sweet love remember, when I think of your love, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. So when I think of your love, what does it do for me? Realize how rich I am, I'm the luckiest man alive. Now I wouldn't change places with who? King. Up here, I'm changing places with anyone. Walk down the street, there's a bum, I want him. Here, I take the wealthiest person in the world, the envy of the whole universe, the king, I wouldn't change my state with him. Just because you bring me, your love, remember, brings me such wealth. Is it a physical wealth? Probably not. Probably not. It's a metaphorical wealth, but you have this complete turn. So you've got quatrain, 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 couplet. You've got an octet with a turn and then a sestet afterwards, thematically linked lines. So let's stop. Can I clarify what he's saying in the poem? Okay. So we look at the connections between the quatrain. Obviously, we want to look at that connection between the first and the second quatrain, just like we want to look at the turn from the second to the third quatrain. We want to look at that turn and understand that this is a point in the poem where something has to change. And I would ask my students, if we were learning this poem, what happens? What makes it change? So what actually changes it for here? Not just love. I mean, love is the cause of it, but what actually occurs to him that makes him remember love?
He's beloved.
Sorry?
He's beloved.
Yeah, she's there all along. What happens to him? What's he saying? He thinks about her. Why does he think about her? He doesn't say. It's perchance. What happens to him? Nothing. It just happens. Happily. It just did. There's no cause. It's just random. And that is actually important to this series of sonnets, which we won't get into, but he might have said, I saw someone and reminded me, or someone tried to woo me and I remembered you. And that's what a lot of other poets do. But he says, just randomly, it happened to me. So something just miraculously by fate happened to him. That happens in the turn. We look at the linguistic connections. We talk about different registers. A register is a series of words that have meaning for different people, like the word wealth. If I say the word wealth, and I say, what does it mean? What would you say? Okay, don't say it's all relative. Be done with it.
I mean, sure, of course.
Give me one thing it means. Money, physical money, capital. What's another thing it means? In this poem.
Happiness.
Happiness. All right, so wealth has different registers. If you're a banker, wealth means one thing. If you're a lover, wealth means something else. And Shakespeare, he's not the best at this, but he does play around with these different registers. So if you go back and look at the poem, he wants the word wealth to be both things simultaneously. And the reason you know that is because he scorned to change his state with kings. He scorned to change his state with not just a nice person or a happy person, but the wealthiest person in the country. So he wants you to be aware that he's playing in two different registers at the same time, a capital register and an emotional register. And that's, like I said, he's not really great at that, but some poets do that, and there's usually a reason. And then we look at the implications of those themes. So what's the meaning of the poem? It's for a Hallmark card. What would the meaning of the poem be? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I thought of you today.
And was it a good
made
thing?
my heart sing.
It made my heart sing. So is this the kind of poem that your girlfriend wants to get from you? Really? We'll stay here all night. My wife has no expectations of seeing me since I work at home, so I have nowhere else to go. All right, so this is a romantic poem with a lowercase r. It's a love poem. It's celebrating the virtue of love, and it's actually talking about the transformative power of love, not to the world, because he doesn't actually change, but to his mental state. Okay, Shakespeare is building off of a tradition that we call secular humanism, where he believes that people, individuals, have the power to think themselves into a different state of existence. Now, there isn't Shakespeare, that's secular humanism, but He's talking about a total transformation of self, but nothing actually happens. He just thinks it does. Does that make sense? So it's not that all of a sudden I went out and bought you something, or I realized that you're the best person in the world, so I married you. He doesn't do that. He just remembers it. Did he actually have to prove his love to her? Did he do anything? Did he tell her he loved her? How about this? Did he say anything nice to her? What? Her sweet love remembered such wealth brings to whom? Who did it bring wealth to? To him. Is it about her? Is the poem about her at all? No, it's all about him. He started off being sad, he ends up being pretty happy. What do you know about her? Nothing? That she's dead? Well, he says he remembers her, so that could be an implication of death.
Yeah, I think there's a contrast with this idea of being an outcast state in the beginning. And if you really, if love remembered weren't a retrospective recollection, then his presence would be one of the outcasts. We have her.
So the argument here is that if he were with her, then he wouldn't be outcast, so there must be a separation between he and she. So you're interpreting and saying that really this is a metaphor for death, which is the ultimate sense of separation. And that's
It's like on the inside. He's reflecting it in himself, and that's his riches. But in the world, he's still an outcast.
and that's a very reasonable interpretation. Other poets at the time write, like my favorite, John Donne, will talk about how travel, because this is, before cell phones, before telephones, before anything like that, you can travel 10 miles and it feels like you're 100 countries away. So there's the actual idea of physical separation, there's the idea of fidelity, and are women true to men when they're not around, and blah, blah, blah. I didn't make this up, this is misogynist. Okay, so we'll get into all that. We look at virtues within the text, which we won't do here since we're already past 7:30. What is valued in the poem? So obviously love is valued in the poem, memory is valued in the poem, mental capacity, I'm thinking of myself is valued in the poem. Do you see fortitude? Does he show you that he is moving through the sadness and through his fortitude to be able to find eternity? Do you see any show of temperance here? Is there a show of equity here? Does he do anything prudent? So we would begin with the kids to help to identify different character dimensions within the speaker of the poem and language which tie to the virtues, but we want them to find them rather than us point them out to them. This is not a particularly good poem to talk about prudence, but kids can do it, and they're very creative. Okay, the essential tool in dialectic in the school of logic. Dialectic is an interchange between a master and a student, unequals, right? So we are not on the same playing field at this point in dialectic. I ask you questions, you give me answers. Your answers can be wrong based on what I want to do, right? So we're not equals here. We ask you questions to move forward. You're thinking about it and why. If we had more time, we would delve into the interpretation of the idea of the woman as dead and being remembered versus being separated and being remembered. And we try to find the root of that in the language and talk about where you get that, whether that's valuable or not. We don't, but we could. It builds upon pedagogical questions. So someone said to me, I'm not picking on you, just using because you gave me a nice example of interpretation, that this is a poem about a remembered love who has died. My first question in the literature class would be, show me the text that makes you think that. Where in the poem do you see that? Because you're allowed to feel whatever you want about the poem. If you're going to tell me that Shakespeare is writing it, and this is what he means to say, you better be able to show me the proof. So I would take you back to the text. So we would build upon kind of solid foundational questions and move eventually to interpretive questions. We never start with, what do you feel? It's irrelevant. And to build to a solid idea from a solid basis. We use analogical questions to coach a student from what is known to what is new. So here's the example. An analogical question, an analogy is where you take two things and put them next to each other. The two things have to have something in common, but you don't always see it. So I would say to you, there's this concept of separation. And he's telling you that when he doesn't think of her, he feels low. Okay? Now, here's another form of separation called death. What is the relationship between separation, physical separation, and death? They are analogous, but they're different. So what do they have in common? Go ahead. Belonging, the loneliness. What do they have different? Finality. What else? What's different between just not being with someone and someone being dead? Hope, lack of hope. All right, so if I was just separated from someone and I felt sad, I move over to death, finality, hopelessness. What happens to my sadness? It's enhanced. So as separation gets enhanced to final separation, sadness gets enhanced to despair and destruction. So we use analogies to show how we get from one idea to the other, to the next idea, through logical connections, through language or ideas. That was a little clumsy, but you get the idea. It is teacher-directed. The teacher is the one who's moving the dialectic forward. Finally, we get into the rhetoric stage. We're going to answer questions. We're going to articulate one's ideas. We're going to defend one's ideas. Now, this is the first time in classical education that I actually ask you, what do you think? Because before this, I don't care what you think. I need you to know what the writer is saying. Once you understand the grammar of the poem and the logic of the poem through language and theme, then, and only then, are you qualified to tell me your opinion. Because your opinion is an intelligent and informed interpretation of the poem, not just, poem makes me happy. That's fine, a poem can make you happy. It's an uplifting poem by the end of the poem. But why does it make you happy? I don't know. It's not a helpful opinion. It does nothing to move the world forward. You need to be able to go to why you have the opinion. The answer to why you have the opinion is always something to do with grammar and logic. So that's why we do those first. Is there such a thing as true love? In this poem, what do you think? Sorry? Do you think the speaker of this poem believes in true love? No. Anyone say yes? Yes. Now, does the speaker talk about true love in the poem? No. So to answer this question, you need to give me an interpretation. The answer to this question is not in the poem, but your answer is based in your reading of the poem. These questions move you beyond the text, into your own mind, to your values, your thoughts. Can a woman be attracted to a poor man? What is the relationship between wealth and status and love? Can love overcome all obstacles? And do we believe the speaker? That's one of the best questions I ask modern audiences. This is a love poem, right? Okay, you read it and you say, Shakespeare wrote this, Shakespeare wrote this. We don't talk about Shakespeare, we talk about the speaker of the poem. Because it isn't Shakespeare who's speaking, it's the speaker of the poem. All right? Why did he write this sonnet? Anyone know? Was he writing a sonnet to his girlfriend? Or to his wife? Or to his mistress? Sorry?
Partner?
Or to his partner? Shakespeare wrote a series of 164 sonnets because he was hired to do it. A nobleman, gentry, paid him to write a series of sonnets to his mistress, not his wife, his mistress, and he wrote them and gave them to her. Now this was pretty common in the time, it's called patronage, and you would get status by hiring better and better writers to write these things for you. There was no pretense that this gentry man wrote this. He didn't want to write it. Writing poetry was low class. You wouldn't want to be known as a writer. But he would hire the best writer to write the poem. So Shakespeare wrote these sonnets for someone to give to his mistress, not to his wife. Now, go back and look at the poem. And when he says, thy love, such wealth brings that I scorn to state with kings. Now, you know that he wasn't writing that to his wife, that he was writing it for someone else who didn't know who was paying him to give to his mistress. Does it change the meaning of the poem to you? Does it change the value of those words? Do we believe the speaker? So we can do all that, and then, just to be really annoying, I come back to you and say, I just lied to you. He wrote it to Anne Hathaway, his wife. And it's the truth now. Did it just change the meaning back to something? Now, do you believe me? Which time? In the school of rhetoric, we complicate your thought process. You are no longer allowed to believe your teacher just because your teacher says something. You need to believe it because you believe it. You need to defend and articulate why you believe it. If you want to read this as a sincere love poem, an expression of beauty and love, it's because you want it to be. Not because I told you Shakespeare wrote it, or because someone hired him to, or because it went to his wife, or his mistress, or someone else's, or to his lover. Those could all be possible. You could research, you could look at biography. Some of this is fact, some of it is myth, but in the end, you have to stand by your own opinion, and you have to defend it to me. So this is what we do in the School of Rhetoric. We ask you questions which force you to articulate your ideas, your values around topics, and you have to articulate and defend them, and the answer cannot be because my teacher told me so, because my parents told me so, because the Bible told me so. Those are all fine, but they aren't the end of the discussion. They are just the beginning of it. You have to articulate something because it is true to you, and someone else it may not be true to, and then you have to have a discussion. And that's the whole point of the School of Rhetoric. We eliminate the idea of didacticism or coaching and replace it with comprehension, truth, personal values. And the idea is quite simple, that when students graduate from the School of Rhetoric, they should not be easily swayed by the opinions of other people. They should be able to stand by their opinions, to have strength and meaning behind their opinions, and to articulate and defend them. At the same time, if I tell you something and you come and tell me something the opposite, I should have the courage to be able to take what you say. If it's better than what I think, I should incorporate it and make it mine, so that you will do something better. And that's really hard to do. We do a lot of practice with that. It's hard for everyone to do, especially teenagers. The essential tool at NOVA is the seminar. It is a co-mutual interchange of ideas and thoughts. Everyone in the circle is equal. Each contribution should be value-added. We're not counting, as they do in some pet data schools, how many times your kid talked. I don't care how many times she talks. I care if she says something value-added. Did she help the discussion? Did she add something to her own understanding or our understanding? Because if Brian says this, and someone waits 3 people in and goes, I agree with Brian, and just really repeats what I said in his or her own words, that doesn't do anything for us. It may do something for you, but we're looking for value-added contributions, not just contributions. Each contribution should reflect the background and understanding of the topic. Sometimes the teacher will do what we call break the seminar and interrupt it and say, tell us more about that. Tell me why you think that. Make the person actually justify his or her comment. Sometimes we don't. We let kids do it for each other. And sometimes kids just miss the easy opportunity. Someone says something, outlandish, and everyone just lets it fly. I mean, that happens in real life too. So we don't force them to. We just train them. It is teacher-directed insofar as that we come up with questions that we want to ask in these seminars, but if kids take it in a different way and it's productive, we let them do it, if the idea develops naturally and productively. So that is a little bit, through Shakespeare's 29th sonnet, about the grammar, the logic, and the rhetoric, how we build from one to the other, how it culminates, and how each stage relies on the previous stages. Can I answer any questions about that? How we move through those relatively quickly, I'm sorry, but we could be here for a long time, which is fine with me. Okay. I put on the board some of the resources that I want to recommend to you if you really want to start looking into classical education. NOVA has stage overview documents. They describe in detail the curriculum, the pedagogy, the virtue instruction, and the practice, what it all looks like for each stage of the trivium. We have summaries of those on the website. We have full documents available if you want to email me. I'll send them to you. It's about 30 pages altogether for all 3 documents. Much more in-depth. And if you're interested in that, it helps explain, I think, very clearly what it is we do here and why. Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, published in 1947. This is, as I mentioned, the foundation of the classical education movement. She's a British writer, she's a journalist, she's a novelist, and she was writing, she's not an educator, and she's writing about the problems she sees in education in England, post-World War II and pre, and they also link up exactly with the same movements in America, and her suggestions for why classical education is the way out of it. It is a really important essay to read. I don't agree with everything she says, but it's still extremely important. The Well-Trained Mind. This is the book that our 3 founders kind of latched onto about classical education as the foundation for the school. It is a book about homeschooling. So the authors, first of all, it says it right in the title, that it's a model for classical education at home, and they say in the first chapter that this is for homeschooling, so it's not exactly what we do here, but it does kind of show you the power that classical education holds in the mind of some parents to how it affects their children, as it's written by a mother and daughter who homeschool through the model. And it's, it's a good read. You should take a look at it. It reads like stereo instructions. Don't read it like a narrative and pick it down. Designing Your Own Classical Curriculum by Laura Berkowitz. It's like the Well-Trained Mind, but she's a lot smarter. She's a scholar. She's a Thomist scholar of St. Thomas Aquinas. So it's a much more intellectually rigorous, and it is very specifically Catholic. So it doesn't apply to what we do here, obviously, in certain ways, but in terms of a well-thought-out explanation of how classical education works, it's a much more erudite version of it. There's a book, I have copies in my office if you want to borrow them, called Classical Education by White and Curran, where they outlay the 3 different models of classification I talked about: homeschool, parochial, and other, kind of going to the differences in different models. Norms and Nobility by David Hicks. This is a book about education and what we can hope to get out of it, which very much speaks to the goals of what we do here, especially integrated virtue education. It's a harder book to read. It's a good book to read as a group if you want to get together with some other parents and kind of work your way through it. Lastly, I always recommend The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is my favorite modern writer. The Abolition of Man is not about classical education, but it does speak very specifically to the problems with education and the solutions for education, and it ties very much into what we're trying to do here, and it's just a great read, so highly recommend. It's also a very short book. I would love to hear questions or comments that you have. Please.
Just based on the exercise you just went through, my question is, as you go through the different steps, and what I noticed was when we went from the logic to the rhetoric side of things, when you move from one to the other, in this program, this school, do you keep it as contained as possible, or do you empower the children to start making those connections prematurely to the rhetorical stage? I mean, for instance, when you're in logic, you already start asking a lot of the foundations of the questions that come up on the rhetorical side.
Did everyone hear the question? Did everyone hear the back? The question is, when we're in the logic stage, do we hold kids to that stage? Do we let them move more organically into the rhetoric stage if they're ready? Same question would probably hold true for ground and logic. And the answer is, at NOVA, we artificially arrest the conversation. I want the logic stage kids to stay in the logic stage, even though by 8th grade they are hankering to give their opinions. Man, do they want to give their opinions. Because when you ask a question like, does Atticus Finch, the model of fatherhood, and that question is a textual interpretive question, but then when they go, yeah, no, because, and I don't care. What I'm looking for is what does Harper Lee present about the evidence of Atticus Finch being a good father. And the reason we do that is because we believe that by focusing on those skills, in this case in the logic stage, analytical skills, we will develop them to a higher caliber. Whereas kids are very easy to slide from logic into rhetoric because they just want to give their opinions, but then when you ask them why they believe it, they don't have solid answers. So we use our arrested development on purpose here to help build those skills. Same thing from grammar or logic. We want you to build your memory skills, your data acquisition skills, your data recall skills. We want you to be so good at learning and recalling data that when you're 39 and you're learning about nuclear physics, you can do it because you've got the skills you learned in 1st through 5th grade. Not the content, but the skills. So yes, we don't stop kids. We don't punish them for giving their opinions in the rhetoric stage. We just tend to ignore them. Because it's not what we're looking for. We'll never ask your 2nd grade daughter what she thinks is the most important value in the world. Because, and this is important, we don't care. Because a 2nd grader doesn't have the grammar and logic to articulate rhetorically the most important value in the world. Now she has an opinion about the most important value in the world. It's hopefully something about love or kindness or goodness. I mean, let's hope. But the truth is, from a classical point of view, the opinion of an 8th grader doesn't move the world because it doesn't have the power to persuade someone who disagrees with her that she's right. So it's just unimportant to us. So we try not to kibosh it, but we don't encourage it. Does that answer your question? And some kids, when they're 8 years old, are ready to move to the logic stage. And some kids, when they're 17 years old, can't get into the rhetoric stage no matter what you do. They won't move away from the text. So this is a psychological development, not just a stage thing. But because we're a school and not a homeschool, we kind of set these grades artificially and work different exercises to promulgate the goals of each stage. Other questions? Yes, please.
This might be a little off topic. I have my daughter's a new 9th grader, and
Correct.
She's not always, okay, well, can you talk about that as far as the policy? I mean, I can understand, Wikipedia, there's a lot of good information on there, and I think it's really important to teach the kids, more so than when we were kids, how to distinguish good sources from bad sources.
Okay, this may be a little clumsy of an explanation, but I have two degrees in English literature, both of them in Renaissance poetry. I've written two theses in 16th and 17th century verse. So if you and I were to have a conversation with a third party about Shakespeare's 29th sonnet, and let's just say that you don't have that background, are our opinions equal? No, mine should be more valuable, I hope, because my mother invested a lot of money in that. So I'm going to let her know that you should be listening to me more because I know more about it. The same thing is true on the internet. There are a lot of ideas out there, but until we teach children how to interpret the ethos or the validity or the credibility of the sources, they cannot distinguish. People think that I have this problem with Wikipedia. I have no problem with Wikipedia. Wikipedia, when I was a kid, I had a set of World Book encyclopedia in my house that my parents bought from a door-to-door salesman, and it made me think I was really, really smart. There's nothing wrong with Wikipedia as long as you understand what it is to be used for. The same thing is true of any internet source. If you get an article from a peer-reviewed scholarly journal, an op-ed from the New York Times, or an 11th grader's high school paper on the Scarlet Letter, if you don't possess the tools to distinguish the value of their opinions, you can't actually have a conversation. So the reason we don't encourage internet research early on in this time is we need to teach them how to evaluate the ethos or the credibility of the sources based on a number of factors, and then they learn how to integrate those other voices, scholarly, critical, non-critical, with their own without overpowering them. That's part of what we do in this. We start doing it in 8th grade, but it's part of what we do in high school, in school prep. By 11th grade, by 10th grade, by 9th grade, we'll use the internet just in very focused, directed ways. Questions? Comment? I specialize in long answers to short questions. It is my gift. So, I want to thank you for coming. Oh, yes, please. What do I do with intuition? From a classical perspective, intuition is interesting but unimportant. If you're a progressivist, intuition is everything. It just starts you in the right direction. Progressivists believe that your natural instincts are inherently good. Classicists do not. Greek philosophy teaches us that you become a better person morally by studying philosophy, not by exploring your intuitive sense. So it is through understanding the schemes, the tropes, and foundations, and the structures of history and thought that you become a better human being. So your intuition is allowed to be in there, but it doesn't govern your choices or what the next step is. The grammar, the logic, the rhetoric govern the direction of your inquiry, not your intuition. So again, it's not my goal to quash it, it's my goal to use it and direct it productively through the structural step of grammar, logic, rhetoric. The one possible exception to that is in science class, where you have to formulate an hypothesis as part of the scientific method, which is Aristotelian in origin, so it's classical. So you actually form an opinion without data, based on a guess, and then you collect data through observation in certain ways, and use that data to kind of voir dire your hypothesis. And you have to have the integrity to tear your hypothesis apart if the data suggests otherwise. So there's one place where you kind of overstep with the submission, but it is a part of the process to collect data. You're not allowed to stop there. I know, I'm not here to please you, just to talk to you. Intuition is an important part of the creative process. Creative process is not a huge part of what we do here. You've never heard me talk about creativity, individuality, finding yourself, but you'll never hear me say those things. I think it's important by the time you're in the school of rhetoric to find your voice in conjunction with the voices of other people, and not lose your voice in the conversation. But classically, you're not ready to start articulating your voice until you have grammar and logic behind you. So again, I'm not against creativity. It just isn't the focus of what we do here. That's more of a Montessori thing.
You mentioned the Walter mind based on homeschool model.
Yes.
What would we notice? What would the big difference between whether I have read the book and what you're doing here in a public school?
Okay, but the biggest differences between the well-trained mind and what we're doing at NOVA, the two of them that just jump into my head is number one, the question earlier. At know that the grammar stage is kindergarten through 5th grade. At home, grammar stage ends when your kids are right before bed. So you actually have the ability to adapt the model on the fly with your child. Number 2, virtue education is through a social consciousness. So we talk about what's good, what's true, and what's beautiful in a civic sense. It's a public school. Our goal is to create citizens. Right? At home, you can describe virtue however you want. It can be based on your religion, it can be based on your ideology, it can be based on your proclivities, it can be based on Epicureanism. So you can choose what is good within your home. In a public school, you know, this idea of collectivism, democracy is the basis of what is good. So it's a little more centered around perhaps a little more banal values that hopefully families can comport with because they can build from those to their own family values. But if you disagree, if your family that values creativity and this family doesn't, that would be a difference in a homeschool. But here, it's just kind of more of a streamline. So off the top of my head, those would probably be 2 of the bigger ones. The other thing I guess I should say that's really important is if you homeschool your kids, you're not a teacher. You're not a trained professional teacher. You may have expertise in a certain field, you may have a background in a certain pedagogy, you may be very intelligent, but professional teachers have different training in child psychology, different data management systems, so we try to leverage the strength that comes with having professional teachers with kids rather than just lay people who happen to be good at certain things or others. In theory, this will sound a little meaner than I need it to be. Anyone can homeschool a 2nd grader, not everyone can homeschool an 11th grader, because you've got to be just as good at Renaissance poetry as non-organic chemistry, and that's a harder skill set to come by.
So the teachers in the grammar stage, what is the training that they're going through that is different? Is there a training here?
The teachers in the grammar stage, there is a training on classical education that all new teachers have to go through. The teachers in the grammar stage is the same training for logic and rhetoric as everyone else, because I feel it's integral for them to see how the skills they're teaching feed into the collective vision at the end. But there's a greater focus on mnemonics, there's a greater focus on memorization, there's a greater focus on creating visual patterns with letters and words to create insular ways, visual ways, auditory ways for kids to remember and memorize and not to comprehend, because it isn't the goal of the grammar stage. So it's more of a tweak of focus. But if you were going to ask what is more like other schools, our grammar school is probably more like other public grammar elementary schools than our logic and rhetoric school, because the kids are doing some of the same things.
So I have a son who's in 6th grade and he entered last year in 5th grade, and you haven't missed all of that, or you've done, you've done because you had regular public?
If you come in as a lateral entry after the school of grammar, basically what you've missed is an intense training in how to take in information and remember it. Now your son or daughter may be good at that naturally, but this is what we teach you to do. It's what we train you how to do in the school of grammar, to bring in a massive amount of data and be able to recall it on cue. And that's a really important skill to have, because you can't talk about rhetoric if you don't have anything to talk about. Sorry, that's a question later.
So when you assign one example tonight, imagine limited potential topics. To what extent is the curriculum set by an external body and the discretionary commission that you can decide what to
Nova's curriculum was made by a curriculum committee, which was comprised of Nova parents and Nova teachers. It grew along with the school. We take into account Minnesota state standards and try to push them by at least a year ahead of the state standards. We try to bring in the best of what Western culture has taught us. It's a Western-focused school. We try to put primary sources in the hands of kids as soon as they can reasonably deal with them. So your 6th graders are reading translations of Tacitus. That's really hard. They're reading Shane verse translation of Balaam. That's really hard to do, but they can do it with a lot of support. So we take all those different things into account. The curriculum map is set by the curriculum committee. It's approved by the board of directors. All the teachers use it. There is discretion within that for teachers to go into enrichment beyond that, but they're not allowed not to follow the map. And the curriculum committee is a board committee. It's open for parents to join, either as committee members or come to their meetings and participate, input, or whatever you want. It's a democratic process. There was another question over here. Yes, sir.
In terms of the outcome, so kids come out of the school with certain, how do you judge what are the data that say this outcome is better than another?
All right, so the question is, kids come out of school with certain makeup. What are the data that we use to judge or justify whether this particular methodology is better than others? So the short answer is we don't have the data yet, because this is our first graduating class, so just hang tight and hope. The longer answer is for me, it's very simple. This is probably going to sound mean again. Okay. I sometimes sound meaner than I mean to be, so don't take me too seriously. Okay. I don't care what your kids do for the rest of their lives. It's none of my business. I really don't care. What I do care is that the school sets them up to do it successfully and well, with a certain verb and force which makes them a leader, a powerhouse, if they want to be. I want your children to be able to choose their paths and be more successful at it than people standing to their left and to their right. And to that degree, the classical model teaches the skills of how to learn anything, the grammar, understand anything, the logic, and articulate what's important and why, the rhetoric. So whether you want to go into traffic engineering, you want to be a poet or a journalist, or you want to be a hobo, it doesn't really matter because you have the skills to become the best version of that possible. So I don't have data yet, other than, our kids take the ACTs and their average score for this junior class last year was 29.5, which is several deviations above the national norm for kids that go to college. Our kids take the PSATs. We have 13% of our kids national merit semifinalists. I mean, we do well with tests, so there is some data there. But the goal is really to live the well-articulated, meaningful life of your own choosing, and that's going to take another 15 years to do.
I was asking more general questions.
Okay.
Other people may try this.
No one's really tried this. There are classical schools, and there are classical schools in America, but the oldest ones, which are about 30 years old, are all parochial schools. So, in my view, the reason that classical education needs to exist in the public sphere is because if it's a parochial school, and I have nothing against religious education or religion in general, but if it's a religious school, there's dogma, which means there's a certain set of answers to questions before the questions are even asked. Okay, that's what dogma means. The answer is delivered to you rather than you figure it out yourself. Again, I'm not knocking it, I'm just saying that's what religion means. So, in classical education, there are no answers before we get in the room and discuss and debate what the answers actually are. Now, there is in truth and meaning, but we have to discover it through dialectic. So, other schools do this kind of thing, but if there's a predestined end, if there are certain realms of knowledge which are not open to interrogation because they're dogmatic rather than rational, then to me that isn't true classical education in a Greek sense. And public education, in a classical sense, is a very new concept. We were the first classical public school in the state of Minnesota. It is a very new idea. And homeschool tends to be focused more on religion as well. There just happens to be, that's the component of the state, the population of the states, that gravitated towards homeschool classical education. So no, there isn't a lot of data out there. There are several dissertations, I've read them, about classical education. There's a lot of focus on what it might do, but there is not a lot of data. This is actually relatively new in American education. Sorry, so you're on the vanguard here. Go ahead, disagree. Well, it is after 8, so if you want to leave, you don't have to stay. Thank you very much for coming. I'm happy to stay around and talk and answer questions. But thank you, and this is the thanks to the PTO. And make sure, buy your Great Gatherings tickets for the kickoff parties, sign up for parties, buy a hat, have some cookies, have some coffee. PTO, go PTO. Happy to stay talk to you guys. Just want to say you need to go, you can go. And remember, these slides, this entire PowerPoint presentation is up on the Family Life portion of our website under Parent. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Correct.
More or less just helpful information. I don't question that's a problem with that. Memorization is great. You have to have content. But it sounds as though it was more of a kind of organic or by stage growth model.
Yes.
So that
You're right. Look, you're absolutely right. One of the critiques of classical education is that we're not teaching kids to think. We're teaching them what they call drill and kill. And that is immature and incorrect assessment. What they're talking about is the grammar stage. If we stop at the grammar stage, then it wouldn't be completely dogmatic, right? But the point of the grammar stage is that it leads you skill-wise to move into the logic stage. If you stay at the grammar stage, then yes, I agree. So it is a portion of it. You should think about 3 stages of the trivium this way as a psychological development, like Freud's stage of development, the human stage of development, you move from one to the other. If you were to stop in one, then yes, you're absolutely right. That would be correct. That would be correct. The difference between novas that the 3rd grade we do chance, and 3rd grade at Trinity they do catechism. It's the same thing. It's just that we have different ends by the time we're at the logic and rhetoric stage. And yes?
Well, you sort of laid out, a foundational approach to making that in 9th grade. Are there ideas, speakers, or resources to get grammar and logic preserved?
It is difficult to make up the missed time. What we will focus on are the skills. So in this case, what it says, focus on the skills that your child has missed. The ability to amass and memorize information, to take it in, depends how good he or she is at it. Logic stage, we actually teach Aristotelian logic because we want you to understand the foundational connection between thoughts. So that is a difficult thing to make up. I could give you some resources that we could what's called Socratic logic by Peter Creed. It is either religious instructive, but it's a very clear kind of book about logic. But we want to teach syllogisms, we want to teach with the square of opposition, major supposition and proposition ideas, so you can understand how ideas relate to each other. So if you were to say, all students who come into Nova at 9th grade are screwed, or some students who come into Nova at 9th grade are fine. There's a universal, and there's a particular, there's affirmative and negative, and understanding the values of the statements help you to dissect how they relate to other things. So I can give you some resources, but your kids have to pick it up on the fly, and they'll have the same ability, they just won't have the vocabulary to do it as some of the other kids. So it's not the end of the world. Other kids that come in 9th grade and survive just fine. We've been doing this for a couple of years. It's hard, but it's like a wave. It'll crest at some point. The middle of October is when it starts to crest for some people, and for everyone else, it's throughout the whole year. But it will happen for everyone. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Why do we have subject matter driven by
We don't have subject matter driven by student interest because students' interests are not the most important thing. In some cases, it's the least important thing. It is my teacher's job to grab your children's attention and keep it, but we believe that fundamental knowledge, the kind of knowledge of history and the virtues of human history, the great thinkers and writers in the Western world are engaging, they're interesting, they're dynamic, and they lead you to a better life, and that itself will be interesting. So their attention is ours to captivate and ours to lose. So that is a little bit of a difference for a child, a little harder. But in the end, what interests your child is not really what moves forward the whole of Western civilization. So from a classical point of view, we premise upon this build educational model. Our goal isn't to discover their individuality. It's that they learn to participate in the tradition of Western history and build upon it to make it better. So we teach them that rather than that. I know that sounds a little, understand I'm speaking in absolutes and that isn't the way it actually works out. Philosophically, that's where we are on your children and their interests. They have nights and weekends to explore their interests. Here they'll explore it regularly. Anything else, folks? I really do want to thank you for coming and staying with me. Come over to the PTO table and have a good night.